This is Ed Rep Radio, presented by Eastman Music Company. This is Ed Rep Radio, a podcast to bring you ideas and information from industry experts you can use on the road every day. Presented by Eastman Music Company, and I'm your host, Shane Dool. Today we are talking with Alexis Smith of the Shires Brass Company, going over everything you need to know about trombones. While at first glance, this instrument might seem like it's more simply constructed compared to a woodwind with lots of keywork or multiple valves of like a French horn or a trumpet, there's actually a lot to trombones. We'll go over the differences between beginner and step-up trombones, the type of brass used in making the bells, how bore sizes affect the sound and the feel of the trombone, and the various valves used in the F attachment, and so much more. Alexis, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
We're talking about one of your favorite topics today, right? Trombones.
It's my favorite.
That's good. Well, you're the perfect person to talk to. You're in the Shires showroom right now, or in the Shires workshop.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you got to where you are at Shires, what you do there in your kind of journey through music?
Yeah, it's definitely a pretty interesting journey. I trained pretty much my whole life to be a performer. So I went to Interlochen Arts Academy for 3 years. Then I went to Manhattan School of Music for undergrad, and then Juilliard for grad school. And while I was at Juilliard, I realized, I saw the people around me and how incredible they were. And I was like, oh my gosh, I have a lot of other interests. So I actually launched a small PR website
Huh.
and used that to get into artist management, public relations. And that was amazing. That was wonderful.
Huh.
But then I kind of missed performance.
Yeah.
So while I was figuring it out and practicing, I ended up working in restaurants for a while. And then I got a call, sort of serendipitously, from a brass quintet called Seraph Brass.
Okay.
And then I also, at the same time, got a call from Adele to join her tour.
Adele?
Yeah.
Wow.
It was a weird phone call.
That's cool.
Yeah. And so I ended up going on the road. And I realized how much I really, really missed playing music. So I ended up applying to get a doctorate at BU. And I still worked for a PR company, still worked for an artist management company, and was just really at a loss for how to combine all of it. And this job opened up, and it was a dream job. I saw the listing and I was like, you've got to be kidding me. But the only thing I didn't really know was equipment.
Ah.
So, so I ended up studying for like 6 months for the interview for this job. And the more I started learning, because to be honest, before I got this job, I was like, oh, equipment doesn't matter, just practice harder.
That's
And
a lot of musicians, right? You play what
right,
you know and you just keep going on the same thing you have.
totally, totally. And the more I started studying, the more I started picking people's brains, I realized like equipment actually makes a huge difference. Like obviously there's no substitution for how much time you put in the practice room, but you can certainly make your life a lot easier. And it's this huge sound puzzle and it's a lot of fun.
Sound puzzle.
So
I like that word.
yeah, I think of it as like a sound Sudoku in a way. But ended up obviously getting the job, and I feel so unbelievably lucky.
What's your role there at Shires?
So my role, whenever anybody is looking for a new horn, whether it is someone from college, some of our artists, they'll come to the showroom and I'm the person that fits them. So they'll play for me, and from there I get to work with them on this very like one-on-one setting to find them the perfect horn. And I always say at the end of the day, what we're looking for is to bring your sound concept across the stage most easily. Our job as musicians is already hard enough as it is, so let's just make it easy for you. So I do all of the retail appointments, and then I do the correspondence. So if you write an email, most likely I'm the person that responds to you. I do a lot of the social media. I work with Sam, my boss, really closely, Samantha Lane, to make sure that the marketing, what you see is like this beautiful representation of the whole of our company.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a lot of this and that. And I really like that aspect of it.
Okay. Yeah. And how long have you been at Shires now?
This is my fourth year.
Wow, time flies.
Yeah.
Amazing. Well, the last 2 years were kind of a wormhole of time.
Yeah.
It's hard to say what day is what
Still in a
day.
wormhole
Yeah.
sometimes.
Yeah. So true. So I find the history of Shires, particularly on the trombone side, kind of interesting. Can you walk us through the company a bit and how Shires started and who started it?
Yeah, yeah. So it was started in 1995 by Steve Shires, Lou Anderson, and Chuck Shepard. Chuck is actually still here.
Huh.
If you have issues with dents, most likely it's going to be Chuck who fixes your horn. I always like to say Chuck has probably forgotten more about brass instrument history than I know currently.
Wow.
He's a guru. And since then, since 1995, from the basement, we've actually expanded to have about 30 craftsmen and women at our factory, and we are currently undergoing an 8,000 square foot expansion.
Yeah.
So it is incredible to see. We are super excited about the expansion, but from 3 people to 30, and we still put so much attention, so much thought to detail with every single horn.
Hmm. That's what Shires is known for, right? Just this incredible craftsmanship and detail, and especially at the custom level. That's a class in its own.
Yeah, yeah, and even when I was a high school kid, Shires was always the aspirational brand. Like when I grow up, I want to play a Shires.
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember as a trumpet player, Shires was always kind of like this mystical brand that I'd heard of, but I've never seen. It's like, oh, this guy has a Shires. Wow, that's amazing. Where did you find that? Because before Eastman purchased Shires, they were actually, there weren't a lot of Shires dealers in the world. So
Right.
you had to go to a show or you had to be lucky to find a Shires uh, dealership that was nearby. So it was this amazing mystical brand that was out there in the brass world. But now they're a lot more accessible, which is why we're talking about them today, because they're a part of
Yeah.
Eastman Music Company. What year did that would happen? 2015, if I remember correctly.
2014, 2015. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm going to defer to you on that one.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think that's about right. 2015. Like I said, it's just been a
I
blur,
trust you.
wormhole of time. So Shires is in Holliston.
Yes, so we're located in Holliston, which is about 40 minutes outside of Boston. So it's great. You could get like a lobster roll and then get a trombone
The,
slash trumpet.
both amazing. The lobster rolls and the trombones. Such good lobster
You know,
rolls.
it's funny. I finally had a lobster roll for the first time
What?
last week. Yeah. It was so
Oh,
good.
they're so bad for you, but they're so good.
So good.
If you're listening, if you've ever been to Boston, you got to try the lobster rolls. They're really
Oh
amazing.
my
It's
God.
like Mexican food in Tucson. It's just something you have to do. All
Absolutely.
right. So Shires is there. You have a workshop of only 30 people. And then Eastman purchases Shires in 2015 and then obviously expands the level of business that we can do throughout the country. Uh,
Yes.
but what we're talking about today is the trombone as an instrument itself. And it's, being in retail and then working for Eastman and being affiliated with Shires, I've learned so much about trombones too. And that there are actually a lot of options on trombones out there, especially when you look at what Shires does. So let's start with the very basics. Let's start
Yeah.
with, where did the trombone start as an instrument in the world?
So the trombone, actually, it's really interesting because the trombone has not really changed that much since the 1400s. And,
Whoa.
I know someone's going to write in and be like, well, actually, blurb, blurb, blurb. So kudos to you. But it's around the 1400s. And originally, a trombone, they were used to actually help with the choir. So you see
Hmm.
alto, tenor, bass. And a lot of that, especially if you look at like Mozart Requiem, the trombone section, each part is providing the support for the chorus.
Okay.
So the parts are actually incredibly interesting. And I read something a little while ago saying that sacred music is much more involved than secular music because the church had more money, so they were able to hire the better musicians and better
Oh,
composers. So, yeah, so
okay.
some of those older religious works are actually kind of hard.
So the tenor trombone would double basically the tenor voice part, and the bass trombone would double the.
Exactly.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, it's really, really cool writing.
All right, so it's been
I
around a
always get
while.
excited. Yes, and it hasn't changed all that much. I'm trying to think of any huge. I think one of the biggest innovations would be the valve, and that wasn't until fairly recently. I believe the 1900s.
Huh. Okay. Yeah, that is
Yeah.
in terms of musical history, that is pretty recent.
Yep.
Okay, so the audience we're talking to are ed reps. They're out there renting lots of beginning instruments, and I'd say they do that. When it comes to trombones, they do way more beginning instruments by sheer volume than step ups. So let's start with the beginning level trombone. So if you're an Eastman dealer, that would be like the ETB 221. That's the beginning level Eastman trombone. So Alexis, the beginning trombone, it looks very different than the step up trombones. So why do we start on this basic beginning level trombone?
Well, if you think about it, when you generally start an instrument, you're probably 10. I mean, I'm just saying, I started when I was 10.
Okay.
And I know a lot of kids start around that age, like fourth grade to sixth grade or so. And you're a tiny kid. So if you just even think about it physically, having those smaller horns like the ETB, that's a 500 bore. So that's a lot easier to push air through than, say, something like a 547 bore, which is a traditional large bore tenor, or a 562 bore. So having that 500 bore allows you to very easily and with the least amount of effort push air through the horn.
Mm. And
The
therefore make a
other thing,
sound, right?
yeah,
If it's easier to push air.
exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. Also, with that instrument, you have that nickel slide and an 8-inch bell. So all of this comes together to make a very efficient horn. So the beginning student can easily learn how to articulate. They can project forward, and the sound stays together instead of kind of getting like woofy or diffuse.
Mm.
So it's a way for kids to just start getting the fundamentals and have fun without it being this kind of impossible feat.
Yeah. Okay. So everything's smaller, right? Smaller bell, smaller bore, uh,
Smaller mouthpiece.
smaller
Yeah.
mouthpiece. Yeah, we're gonna. I
Yep.
want to talk specifically about mouthpieces after we go through the trombones, because that's a really
Yeah.
important part. I know for brass.
Yes.
Um, so I imagine it weighs less, right? If you don't have all the extra stuff too.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Usually you end up in fact, pretty much the entire time you add a counterweight to the back so you have a nice balance while you're holding it.
Okay, I guess that's a good question. The counterweight, that circle of weight back there, is just to keep it from being bell heavy, right?
Yep, exactly. So for larger trombones with the valve is that additional weight, so you
Ah,
don't have to deal with the counterweight.
okay, okay. So a straight tenor, which is what we're talking about, this beginning trombone, it has the counterweight, but
Yep,
in a step up trombone with the F attachment, which we'll get into, that's the counterweight.
yep,
Got it.
pretty much.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
exactly.
And this is what you started on as a trombonist.
Yeah, I did. I did. I started on a small bore trombone, counterweight. I probably could have hit that thing against the wall and it'd probably have stayed in one piece as well.
Durable is good.
Yeah, it was very
Yeah,
durable.
yeah. So, when you were a player, and I guess speaking generally as a trombonist, when do you know that you've kind of outgrown that beginning trombone? How do you know when it's time to get into that step up?
That's a really great question. I think it can really depend on the individual, but there are two things I would say. One, and it's always one of my first questions, even with much more advanced players, is how does the horn feel? So when the horn starts feeling tight, especially something like a 500 bore or even a 508 bore, when it starts feeling like it's pushing back against you, like you feel restricted with the air you can push through, you're probably outgrowing the horn then. You're probably going to need something slightly larger, like a 525, which is a medium bore, or a 547, which is the traditional large bore.
Okay.
So that's one of the things I say when it starts to feel like you can even think of it as outgrowing clothes. Like it's starting to feel just a little tight. You
Hmm.
don't feel quite comfortable.
Yeah.
Um, or if, like, personally, when I played trombone, I like hopped right into I was obsessed with it.
Hmm.
And I started wanting to play more advanced music pretty quickly. And for that, I needed a trigger. And my teacher at the time was like, I think she's ready. I think she's committed enough where you can make the investment and take the step forward or step up.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah, we'll get into what that trigger does in a second.
Yeah.
I want to stop for a second and talk again about bore. That name, that
Yep.
word has come up a little bit. 500, 525, 547. Um, for someone who's maybe new to that term and they're not entirely sure what we're referring to, what exactly is the bore that we're talking about, and where is it measured, and what does it really do?
Yeah, so I think actually bore is we steal it from like a piston engine. I think I actually should look that up before I am quoted for that, but it's basically the diameter of the slide, the tube of the slide.
Okay. How big around it is.
Exactly.
Yeah. So the slide in a beginning trombone is 0.500 inches, so half an inch across
Correct.
at the slide, the inner slide tube, right? Yeah.
Yes.
All right. And then you mentioned another bore, 0.525 inches.
Yes. Yes. So that is considered generally medium bore.
Okay.
I think it's very, very versatile. I love playing a medium bore slide because you can play orchestral music still, but you could also play a little bit more commercial music. I mean, I can talk about the characteristics of medium bore versus large bore
Yeah.
slides
Yeah.
until, you all are super bored.
Oh,
But I think the cool thing about a medium bore is it's incredibly versatile. You can take it from a commercial gig to an orchestral gig. It's the slide that I play on because I need some help with the higher register sometime.
okay.
So the 525 gives me that extra like 5% that I don't want to work as hard for.
Okay. And then the large bore, 0.547 inches. That's your most
Yeah,
common, though, isn't it? For a step up trombone?
correct. Sometimes it depends on the manufacturer, but the 547, when you step up, you're going to be looking at a 547, which is a traditional orchestral slide bore.
Okay.
It has a little bit more width, a little bit more color. It's a little bit darker and wider than something like a 525 and certainly a 508 or 500 bore.
Okay. If you were to compare the sound from one extreme to the other, so the sound of a 0.500, that student trombone, and a
Uh-huh.
0.547, large bore
Yeah.
trombone, what do you hear sound wise when you change the bore size like that?
Yeah. So for like a 500 bore, I always think of it a little bit more of like a jazz sound. Like it's very compact. It has a lot of clarity. It projects forward incredibly well.
Mm,
Like it's going to be incredibly efficient. But you might not get a huge color palette. Like it's going to be a very bright, very strident sound,
okay.
most likely. Whereas when you go to something like a 547, relatively, it will be I guess mellow isn't the right word, but it will have more density to the sound. It'll be a little bit darker, slightly wider and rounder, and better for blending.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's going to still project forward, but it's not going to have that like ping that some 500 bore slides do have.
Yeah, got it. So that makes sense that the 500 bore, same as the beginning level instruments, those are also popular in jazz and marching band and
Exactly.
pep band,
Yeah.
right? Because they just cut
Yep.
through.
Exactly.
Okay. So what do you feel as a player if you were to play a 500 bore, the small bore trombone, and you play a 547 large bore? What do you feel?
So that can vary from player to player, but generally the 547, you're going to be blowing a lot more air. You're going to just feel like you're like almost like a bellows, like you're just cycling through air.
Hmm.
And you're going to fill up more space. It's a weird thing. Like you feel very it's a I don't even know how to say it, but it feels like you're filling up space.
Okay. Okay.
And you're going to feel that the articulations, you're going to have to work a little bit harder for the articulations because now your target is much larger.
Something I see a lot when I work personally with students who are going from a 500 bore trombone, typically you see this, they're coming into the music store, they have their rental trombone that when they started on, they played it for a couple of years and they're ready for their step up. Their teacher said, okay, go get your F attachment trombone, your large bore trombone. And I see this all the time. And I know ed reps out there are shaking their head saying, yeah, I see this too, where you have a kid who's used to this small bore and they come in and they try this large bore and they feel like they're just wallowing in this massive trombone with this huge
Yeah.
bore, like, and their sound is actually pretty small. Do you
Yeah.
have some tips for everybody who works with that kind of student who's transitioning to have more
Ye-
success early on in that large bore?
that's also a fantastic question. The big thing that I tell kids, because you don't want to scare a kid, you don't want them to shut down. Is just be like, this is totally natural. Like, you do not need to freak out about this. Like, this is 100% natural. And then I try to explain what's happening. Like, you're going to a larger horn, you will need to be pushing through air. And I try and just give them I always have them sit in a chair for this because sometimes they get dizzy.
Huh,
You don't want anyone passing out.
right.
Uh, but I just try and I have them play and I don't say anything. And this might not work with every student, but the big thing I try and let them do is I just try and let them to take time and get acclimated
Mm.
because they start to figure it out.
Oh, okay.
I would never put them on something like a huge valve, like an axial, but I would try to get them on equipment that, you have the soldered bead wire, you have the nickel crook, you have the two-piece bell. All of these things give a little bit more stability.
Hmm.
Uh, so I think that also does help.
Okay. Okay. Sometimes when I'm in that situation, I'll do literally a breathing lesson with the student. And I find it does two things. It'll actually get them to calm down a little bit, and focus because it's almost like you're doing yoga, you're right? Because you're doing deep breaths
Yeah.
and controlled breaths out. And then they start to focus and they calm down a little bit, but they're also remembering how to take deep breaths and blowing it out. And it really makes a big difference with the sound of the trombone. And I've seen it actually close sales, where a kid comes in and at first they're discouraged because they don't sound very good on this large bore. Then after a breathing lesson, they're like, oh, okay, I sound way better. Let's buy it. So just from personal
That's a
experience.
great idea.
Yeah.
That's a fantastic idea. I'm going to steal it.
Feel free, everyone. Go ahead. So I get the next topic. We talked about bore and the differences there. I want to talk about this thing that was mentioned a little bit, the F attachment in the valves, because that's one of the most obvious things you see and you get when you go up to a step up trombone. What's the F attachment? What does it do?
So the F attachment, I think of it as the heart of the instrument. In the most simplistic of terms, the F attachment allows you to kind of cheat. Like, you can play notes that you would normally play in sixth. You could play that in first position and just push down on the trigger. Same with seventh position. You could play those notes in second position and push down on the trigger. And voila. But the valve actually does so much more than
Hmm.
that. So I always, whenever I put together horns for people, I always start with the valve because, and again, it's the heart of the instrument because the valve determines the feel of the horn, whether it feels super open or tight. It determines the articulation and it determines the sound. And even when the valve is not in use, it still has a huge effect on the horn.
Because air is always flowing through the valve, right? Whether you have it depressed or not.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, yeah, huge difference.
So you can see when you look at a big wall of trombones, if you ever have the opportunity to look at all the options, there's a lot of different valves. Can you walk us through, starting with the most common, and walk us through a few of the different options and how they feel different?
Yeah. So why don't we start with kind of the two opposite ends of the spectrum? And for Q series, we actually offer these two valves as well because they are so different. So we have our rotor valve and we have our axial valve.
Okay.
So the axial valve, it is, I think, it is the largest valve. So even when you just look at it physically, it's that cone shaped valve. Even when you look at it physically, it's much larger than a rotor valve, which is the circular valve.
Okay.
And so it takes a lot more air. So for kids who are just throwing air through the horn, the axial valve is generally a really good fit. The
Okay.
axial valve does a couple things. The sound is different in that it generally has probably the most depth of a valve. Like, it's definitely the most traditionally orchestral valve.
Hmm.
It also, the articulations, they're generally the most round and warm and wide. And it's very, very beneficial for the low range.
Oh, okay.
On the opposite end of the spectrum, you have the rotor valve, traditional rotary valve, let's say. And physically, it's a smaller valve than the axial. So it's a much more efficient valve. And with the sound, it's a little bit more compact. It has a little bit more clarity, and the articulations have a much more clearer front to the
Hmm.
sound.
Okay.
Yeah. And you might not get as much depth, but you're going to get a lot of clarity and projection. So, the interesting things about valves as well is like I play an axial valve, but I completely understand why someone would want to play a rotor valve. It's a very personal thing.
Hmm.
And so, in between both those valves, we have a lot of valves in the middle.
I was just
Sorry.
thinking, if you have a student, coming off their beginning trombone, the one we were talking about coming into the music store, it's time to step up. Do you have some suggestions on which type of valve would work for that kid who again just kind of,
Yeah,
I I hate to use the word again, but wallowing in this big trombone? Is there one that would be a little easier for the less developed student?
definitely a rotor valve.
Okay.
It takes significantly less air and it helps with higher register because it's so efficient, and it helps with the fronts of notes for clarity. So I would say that the rotor valve is a great way to transition a kid
Hmm.
to the valve.
Okay. And the axial is a little too open for them?
It can be way too open.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, especially if it's a younger kid. You might have a kid who's just pumping air through the horn, in which case, yeah, try the axial, but most likely the rotor is going to be the way to go.
Okay. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the lead pipes. And if you're listening and you're an Eastman or a Shires dealer, you'll know that in like the 800 series Eastman or the Q series Shires or the custom series Shires, the tenor trombones and the bass trombones, they come with extra lead pipes in the case. What do those do? Why are they in there?
So most companies, they have fixed lead pipes, so the lead pipe is actually brazed into the horn. But the cool thing about us is that we have lead pipes that can be changed out. So you have this really small, easy way to customize the horn for you. So with every Shires horn, you get three brass lead pipes or one sterling silver. And with those three brass lead pipes, we send you the most popular sizes. So a one, a two, and a three.
Okay.
And what we mean by that is the venturi. So the venturi is basically a system for speeding the flow of fluid or air by constricting it in kind of a cone shaped tube. So if you hold the lead pipe up, you'll actually see that it chokes and then flares.
Hmm.
Uh, and the difference of the venturi size corresponds to the size of our lead pipes. So a two is kind of our Goldilocks lead pipe, but
Goldilocks.
our
Yeah.
one,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Our one lead pipe, it generally has the smallest venturi, which means that it's going to feel super stable. You're going to have great slotting. Articulation is going to be very efficient. On the other hand, you have our three lead pipe, whereas it has a much more open venturi. So it's going to be very flexible, very supple. You're going to have a great legato. Sometimes people feel like the one is a little too tight or the three is a little bit too open, which
Hmm.
is why we have our two, and which is why we call it our Goldilocks lead pipe. So it's kind of the best of both worlds.
It's just
You know,
right.
you exactly, exactly. So those are brass lead pipes. You could also have lead pipes that are about an inch longer,
Hmm.
and that length difference gives you a little bit more stability.
Okay.
Yeah, we also offer sterling silver lead pipes, which those are have a lot of efficiency to them. It's great for articulations, it's great for creating a lot of core in the sound. And from there we can make all these sorts of different changes to lead pipes. But lead pipes will really affect the feel of the instrument.
Okay. Yeah. Something I've seen again, kind of working with that young player coming into the store. Those lead pipes can make or break a sale. I found if you have again that kid who just doesn't have the air for the large bore. I've noticed if you put them on a rotor, like our Q series trombone with a rotor, and then you put a number one lead pipe, it's
Yeah.
to a pro that's going to feel pretty tight, but to a beginner that feels really good. And I've seen
Yeah.
it actually make the difference between selling the trombone and not, because it seems to help. Same thing what we were talking about with that rotor. It seems to help that young player transition from that little trombone to the big one.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So the one lead pipe is going to be great because it's going to just take that 547 and just make it a little bit easier. And the cool thing with having a lead pipe that you can change is that as they get more used to it, they can always go to a slightly larger lead pipe. But starting them on a lead pipe where it just makes things a little bit easier
Hmm.
as they get used to the horn is huge.
Yeah, that's the cool thing about having 3 in the case, right? Or 1 in the trombone and
Yeah,
2 in the case, I should say. 3
exactly.
total. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Yeah, that's pretty cool. But that's people like to say that Shires is like building Lego trombones. You have all these different components you can put on there, including those lead pipes.
100%.
It's fun. So let's go to the bells themselves. Oh, hey, that rhymed. So we have, you look at the showroom and you have so many different colors of bells, to say it, basically. What are we seeing there? What are the different kinds of bells? What materials are changing? What does it do?
Yeah, yeah. So I could easily ramble on about bells, so definitely just yell at me if it's too much or I go on a
Go
tangent,
for it.
like even more so than valve. And okay, so bells I always think of as the soul of the instrument because it has a lot of the intangibles that make a horn so special, like
Hmm.
that shimmering sound, like that it's your personality in a way.
So the valve is
So
the
bells,
heart, and the bell is the soul.
yeah.
Okay.
um, but so most basic will be the alloy of the bell. So you have yellow, gold, and red. So like our Q series, you have the option between a yellow bell and a gold bell. But what that means when we say yellow, gold, or red, yellow is 70% copper and 30% zinc. Gold brass is 80% copper and 20% zinc. And red brass is 90% copper and 10% zinc. And it all has a huge effect on the sound and the feel of a horn.
Hmm.
So, yellow generally tends to have a lot of clarity. It's very efficient. Your articulations will have great fronts to them. Whereas gold tends to be a little bit warmer, wider, and rounder. It's beautiful for blending. It has a little bit more of a supple feel. And then I always call red brass kind of like a wild stallion
Huh.
because it has the most beautiful, varied color palette, but sometimes it can be hard to control. I think red brass is incredible for solo playing, for chamber playing. They're beautiful bells, but they're not for everyone.
Hmm.
And that's why we have so many bells.
Okay. One thing we didn't mention is that the majority of the beginning trombones, they're made of yellow brass. And it's not really until we get into these step-up trombones that you have these options of yellow, gold, or red. I've been told before that the timbre of the tone will actually change from soft to loud a lot the more copper you get in the brass, so the gold brass and the red brass. Is
Yes.
that true?
Yes, at least in my experience, yes. Which is why I think of red brass with 90% copper as sort of that wild stallion. Like, if you can figure it out, it's going to be incredible.
Hmm.
But yeah, it might get a little splashy. It might be harder to control.
As it gets louder?
Yes.
Ah, okay. So when it comes to the construction of the bells, the way we actually form this brass, there are two different bell types. There's one piece and two-piece bells. What are the differences when it comes to how they sound and how they play?
Yeah, there's a huge difference, and especially how they play and sound. So, both. What I've noticed is one piece bells tend to be very supple, they tend to be quite flexible, and they have this beautiful resonant halo to them. They're gorgeous. With two-piece bells, they tend to have a lot more stability and a lot more density to the sound. So, you have a much more defined core to the sound. Two-piece bells, especially if you have a kid who is looking to step up and already is feeling that size difference, the two-piece bell is going to be a great bet.
Hmm.
Yeah, two-piece bell is a great bell because, and that this might be super nerdy, but I'm just going to talk about it because
Go
this
for it.
is already nerdy and it's delightful. Two-piece bells, they're actually where you meet the bell flare and the bell stem. You have that slight overlap of metal, and that adds a little bit of weight, which is going to give you slightly more stability,
Hmm.
which is why the two-piece bell has that kind of nice core.
Okay. And if no one's ever seen a bell being made, where is that seam that you just mentioned? Where do these two pieces come together?
So it comes together. Oh, it's hard to say without pointing to
Right,
it, but
right.
it comes together right where the bell starts to, I guess, exponentially flare
Really
out.
widen out, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Towards the end of the bell, not towards the part by your head. So if you were to look at the projection of a one-piece bell versus a two-piece bell, and you're sitting in the audience listening to these trombones being played, one being a one-piece, one being a two-piece, do you hear a difference?
I think between a one piece and a two-piece bell, if it's just someone playing at you and you're in the audience, you're definitely going to hear a difference between the width of the sound and the colors of the
Hmm.
sound. A lot of this is determined by the player, but when someone is playing a one piece bell, you hear that additional ring and that additional resonance. Whereas when someone plays a two-piece bell, sometimes you can even hear that it's slightly more stable. A lot of it can come down to if the player feels comfortable or not. And that's a really big part of fitting someone for a horn. But
Hmm.
if you're sitting in the audience and the orchestra is going full steam, you're not going to be like, oh, principal trombone is definitely playing a two-piece bell. But like when we're fitting people, it does make a big difference.
Do you think it's more experienced by the player than the audience?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Got it. So let's go to the hand slide. That's another component of the trombones. One
Yes.
thing that, if you're looking at a beginner trombone versus a step up trombone, a lot of times the step up trombone slides, the main hand slide is wider. Why does that happen?
So a lot of that is because of the sound.
Huh.
So having a slightly wider crook gives the horn almost a more mature sound. There's a little bit more depth to it, and nowadays most orchestral trombones have that wider crook.
Okay. What's a crook?
The crook is like that round part at the bottom of the slide.
Okay. The It
Yeah,
has a little rubber knob on it, right? So when they set it down, that's the crook.
exactly.
Got it. Okay.
Yep,
And do we make those crooks out of different materials?
we do. We do. So a lot of the times our crooks are generally nickel, and nickel gives a lot of clarity and efficiency to the horn. But it isn't unheard of for some players to play a yellow crook, which adds a little more warmth and roundness
Hmm.
to the sound.
Hmm. That's amazing. Just that one piece on the trombone can affect the way it feels and plays.
Oh, it's crazy. It's crazy. It makes me delightfully happy.
You're in a good job then for stuff like that.
I know.
All right, so let's move on to bass trombones. This is not as common for ed reps to work with, but it's certainly a common school purchase and step up purchase for those trombonists who are kind of going down that avenue, wanting to play bass trombone. So let's get into some of the differences between a tenor trombone and a bass trombone.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think there are three huge differences. One is that instead of the traditional 547 slide, you now have a 562 slide.
Bigger.
So, yes, bigger slide. So even when I go from tenor to bass, I'm like, oh, okay. Uh, so if you think you're blowing a lot of air for a 547, you're going to pass out when you play a 562. And then obviously you have that second valve, you have that G flat D valve, which allows you to have even more options when it comes to alternate positions, and it also allows you to play lower. So that's always really exciting, especially for a young kid. You could just pretend to make fart sounds and they're like, yeah, I
Really
want to play
low.
it.
So
Yeah.
is that the main purpose of that second valve, to extend your low range?
Well, it's also for tuning, for intonation,
Oh,
because as you activate the valve, as you go lower on the slide, which is essentially what you're doing when you're activating the valve, the intonation shifts a little bit.
huh.
So, yeah, so you have to be wary of that. But it's also just because bass trombone, it's a larger, definitely more unwieldy instrument. It gives you more options as well.
Okay. Okay, I see. What did you call it again? Those two different valves. One's the F side, right? And what's the other
Yeah,
one?
one's the F and one's the G flat D side.
Oh, okay. Good to know.
And then the other big difference for a bass trombone is that instead of having an 8.5 inch diameter bell, you now probably have a 9.5 inch
Oh,
diameter bell.
wider than
Yeah.
that step up
Yes.
tenor. Okay.
Yes.
So is it right that a beginner trombone's about an 8-inch bell, a step up trombone's an 8.5-inch bell, and then this bass trombone's a 9.5-inch bell? Is that about right? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So I know you have different valve types on a bass trombone. What is it similar to the tenor? The valve selections you can have?
Yes, and it's also similar on how they affect the player and the sound. So, especially if you're moving a kid to bass trombone for the first time, I'd say probably go with rotors.
Hmm. For the same reason, it's a little easier to transition.
Yeah, yeah. Unless the kid is a very experienced tenor player, then you might want to look at axials. But if you're a middle school kid who's looking to play bass trombone for the first time, probably rotors are going to be the best bet.
Hmm. Okay. Sometimes you see in the description of a bass trombone, you have dependent or
Yeah.
independent rotors. What in the world does that mean?
Yeah. So dependent means that you have to use your F valve so you can use your G flat D valve. So that valve is dependent on the F attachment being activated.
Okay.
An independent valve means that you can use your second valve independently of your first valve. Pretty much, I think I only know of one professional trombonist who plays dependent bass
Hmm.
valves. Pretty much everyone else plays independent. You have a lot more flexibility. You have a lot more options for technique. So I would say maybe go with independent.
Independent. Okay. And that's most of what Shires
Yes.
makes, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. And how about bell construction? The one piece versus two piece. Is that similar with bass trombones as the tenor?
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. You have the one piece bell, which is generally very resonant, very supple. Then the two-piece bell, which is going to have a little bit more core.
Okay. And materials too? Yellow brass, gold brass, red brass. Do you see that in bass trombones?
Yes. Yes.
Is there a more
I think
popular
the
one?
big, oop, probably yellow,
Okay.
because it's a little bit easier to control. Sometimes with bass trombone, you are more liable to get a sort of diffuse sound. It's harder to focus the articulation because, again, you're on a much larger bore.
Mm.
So the yellow really helps focus the articulation. You still get that really nice core. The big thing, and this is much more advanced, so this is probably for the 2.0, but you want to really make sure that the bass trombone just doesn't sound like a big tenor. You want to make sure that it's bass trombone and not large tenor trombone,
Mm.
which is hard to explain the difference.
So basically, a good bass trombone player on a good bass trombone it'll have a distinctive bass trombone sound. It won't just sound like a big tenor.
Yes. Yeah.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
I love a
Yeah.
good bass trombone player that they can.
Oh, it's so
It's
good. It's
awesome.
like earthy.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
awesome. Yeah.
So there are a couple other less common trombones I just wanted to brush
Yeah.
on. So the small bore trombones, we make nice high end small bore trombones that aren't student levels. What are those higher end small bore trombones used for?
So we have, I think, really two, and they're radically different. One, those are our commercial horns, our jazz horns. So like back to our 500 bore or 508 bore. We even have one that's a 495 bore.
Hmm.
And those can be used from playing lead in a big band, from playing salsa, marching band, Broadway shows. Those are fantastic horns. And actually, we're really excited about this. We built a small bore F attachment valve that
Wow,
we're really excited about recently.
cool.
Yeah. But yeah, so a smaller bore trombone, it will be a straight trombone. So you just have that neck pipe, that gooseneck neck pipe.
Hmm.
You don't have to really worry about that valve.
Okay. So if I'm a parent and I'm looking at my kid's beginner trombone that costs under $1,000, then I look at one of these small bore jazz trombones. That's a few $1,000s. But on
Yes.
paper, they look similar. What do you really get? What do you hear and what do you find when you play on one of these not really nice jazz trombones versus that beginning trombone?
Yeah, so what you hear, you have a much larger spectrum of sound. It's a much more interesting sound.
Hmm.
The sound, it actually has a lot of character, whereas sometimes you can play these student horns, which are fantastic for students, but as a professional, you're not going to get that sound that you're looking for. It's probably going to sound a little dead, or
Hmm.
it's going to sound very strident. It's not going to have the nuance that you need to succeed as a musician on the professional level. But then also, with some of these student horns, they are built for something very specific, which is stability and efficiency.
Hmm.
But as you become more advanced, you're going to find that you're fighting the horn. You're not going to be able to do what you need to do to really express yourself to find that sound. The horn will probably be more inflexible, which is fantastic for a student, not so fantastic for a professional.
Okay. Yeah. Makes sense. And
Yeah.
then one more trombone, which is certainly the lesser common, but you can see it every now and then come through. Maybe a college will buy it from an ed rep. And that's the alto. What's that all about?
Yeah. I love alto trombone. It makes me super happy. So, alto trombone, it is a horn that is mostly used for period music. So, you think of Mozart, Beethoven, some Brahms, and it has a very compact, very clear sound. I think of it as kind of like the oboe of the brass section.
Huh.
But usually, and again, kind of going back to that whole bass trombone thing, you do not want your alto to sound like a tiny tenor.
Okay.
Bad. But for alto trombone, it really depends what I'm looking for. So if you are, buying it for your college studio, most likely you're looking for a horn that a kid is going to double on. So they might have to play, say, Mahler, and then they might also have to play Brahms on the same concert.
Hmm.
So you want something that's easy for them to go back and forth. So something like a 7-inch bell and a dual bore 485, 495 slide is going to be awesome.
Okay. And these typically you don't find them in student levels, right? These are all professional or custom level instruments. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Like generally, if you're playing alto trombone, you're going to be either a very advanced high school student or college student.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. And there's more information on the Shires website if you want to look at more alto information. But I want to move on
Yeah.
to mouthpieces because this is a big thing in the brass world, right?
Yes. Yes.
Let's start with something that I know ed reps, including myself when I was an ed rep, would come across. You have your beginning trombone, and the beginner or the young student takes his mouthpiece off, puts it in the step up trombone, and it doesn't fit. It's too small. What happened?
Yep.
What?
Yep.
Why?
Well, so you're going from basically a small shank instrument to a large shank instrument, which means your 500 bore slide, it's going to be 500 bore, which is a small shank slide. So generally, anything up to a 508 is small
Mm,
shank. 525 can kind of go either way. So if you have now that same mouthpiece that's used to fitting in a small shank horn and you bring it to a large shank horn like a 547, it's going to be bad news bears. So generally, you have to size up the mouthpiece.
mm.
And not only is that for the shank, but you have to size up the rest of the mouthpiece.
Okay. So, what is the typical size you would find in a on a beginning trombone, for example?
Usually a 12C or an 11C.
Okay, and that's on the smaller size.
Yes, yes.
Why is that important to have a smaller size mouthpiece for beginner?
Well, it's the same reason why you're playing a 500 bore slide and not a 547 bore slide. It's all about efficiency and making sure that, especially a smaller kid, feels comfortable. It also, having a smaller mouthpiece, again, helps with articulation and efficiency. It also helps so you have projection forward. So the 500 bore and the small shank mouthpiece with the small cup, the small rim, it all works together. The big thing for all of that is efficiency and clarity.
Okay. And then when you go up to that large bore, there's a million options out there. But what would you say are kind of the standards that you would see for sizes that would go typically with a step up trombone?
Yeah, so I usually say if this is your first large bore horn, go with like a 6.5 AL. It's on the smaller size, but it's also like, say, going to a rotor valve first. It's going to help with that transition
Hmm.
because you're already going to a larger cup. So there's no reason to go like straight into like the deep end of the pool. The six and a
Hmm.
half is a really, really good mouthpiece to start on. And the interesting thing about that is you start getting acquainted to the sound of a large bore. So, usually, the larger the mouthpiece, the more density and depth of sound you'll get. Some people like to just be like, I want the biggest mouthpiece ever. And don't do that. Don't do that. I think really one of the things to also keep in mind when you're looking at equipment is what fits your neighbor or your teacher might not be what fits you,
Hmm.
and that's okay. At the end of the day, you just want to be able to produce a beautiful sound as easily as possible. So if you end up on a 5G and your best friend is on a 4G, that's okay.
Hmm. So we've been talking about mouthpiece in terms of large and in small and throwing some numbers and letters out. Let's dig in just for a second into um, like you said 6.5 AL or 4G. What do
Yeah.
these things mean?
So this might be also a better 2.0 question,
Okay.
but generally the lower the number, the larger and deeper the cup of the mouthpiece. And different manufacturers have different numbering and lettering systems. It's not, unfortunately, it's not totally uniform.
Right. And it's
I
opposite
think,
sometimes, right? Like the
yeah,
Bach numbering system, the lower the number, the bigger the size. The Schilke numbering system, the higher the number, the bigger the size. It gets a little confusing.
exactly. Yeah. So when I say like 5G, 6.5 AL, I'm using the Shires sizing, which is also, it also corresponds with the box sizing.
Okay.
So that's kind of what I'm referencing.
There's some good charts out there, I think, that if anyone's ever curious what one brand's mouthpiece is equivalent to in another brand's mouthpiece, you can find a chart that gives it, some similarities.
Yeah. Yeah. We also have a chart that's like, oh, if you like, say Shilky's this size, then you'll like our this size.
Okay. Is that on the
Just a
website?
comparison chart. No. If you email
All
us
right.
at info@scshires, we'll be able to shoot it over to you.
Awesome. Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about care and maintenance. You find, you look at the care kits in music stores, and the trumpet one's pretty simple, and then you look at the one with trombone, and there's like four different things in the care kit, all having to do with the slides, and it seems a little bit more in depth than your other brass instruments. Uh, Can you walk us through some of the most important maintenance tips and some of the, I guess, lubricants you'd use for it?
Yeah. Yeah. I always say that spending a little bit of time taking care of your slide each week and valve each week is going to save you thousands of dollars in the long term.
Mm,
So, I guess for daily care, let's talk about your slide. I Whenever I'm playing trombone, I always have a bottle of slide lube and water, like a spray bottle of water
mm,
next to me. And so I will reapply as needed. Now, the big thing to really be careful for is that water is a great activator for most slide lubricants, if not all.
mm.
So you want to make sure that you're like not adding too much lubricant, or else it'll start gumming up your slide.
Okay.
So a really great thing is to take like a brawny paper towel, and every so often, just wipe down the inner tubes of the slide, and sometimes like some green stuff will come off, which is good.
Ugh.
And then you can reapply. I know we're a disgusting bunch. But then you can reapply the slide lubricant of your choice and then just refresh with water as needed.
Do you have a
And
favorite,
then,
by the way? Do you have I mean, there's so many out there. Do you have a favorite type of lubricant or a
yeah,
couple you'd suggest?
I really like, especially for showers, because we have such tight tolerances with our slides. I really like Slido Mix and the Yamaha slide lube, as well as Ultra Pure. They have a really great one.
Okay.
For some starter instruments or like beginner instruments where the tolerances aren't quite as tight, they might find that trombone actually works really well. It's a much thicker grease,
Hmm.
but do not use it on like a Shires or a Q series slide. It's just too gummy.
Okay.
And then from there, what I would say is like once a week, a great thing to do is to take care of your valve. So I usually would do this on a Sunday where I take the slide off of my trombone and I will re-grease the tuning slide with a thicker slide grease than I would use for my hand slide. But then also I will throw rotor oil into my valve. So one of the things that's very important is I will put a paper towel up the slide receiver to absorb any lubricant like rotor oil that goes through the horn.
Interesting.
And I just want to like make sure that the oil coats the inner part of the valve. So I will drop a couple drops, actually a lot of drops, into a tube that feeds into the rotor, and I'll kind of rotate it around. So I'll actually be holding the valve section and the bell, and I'll be sort of like circling it around to like make sure that the rotor oil coats the whole valve, and I'll be also activating the valve as well.
Hmm.
And it's important to have that paper towel up there because generally, when that rotor oil hits your slide oil, it's bad news bears. It
Really?
will get gummy. They do not work together. Yeah.
Huh.
So I'll let it sit for like 5 or 10 minutes as that paper towel absorbs the rotor oil that's kind of dripping through.
Good to know.
Some other small things that are important. I know our cleaning kits come with bearing and linkage oil. And that's just, and it has like a needle nose on it. And that's just to like seal the space between, like, say, the mini ball screws and the physical mini ball. And remember, like, your horn has small spaces in it,
Hmm.
which allows it to move and function, which is great. But sometimes when you use that oil, that grease, it kind of seals it up, which is good. Sometimes the horn will actually play better
Hmm.
when it's properly greased.
Okay. Good to know.
Yeah, yeah. And then I'd say like once a month, it's good to give your slide a bath and swab it out. So, what I would do is I would have lukewarm to warm water. I would take the inner slide and the outer slide, I'd separate the two, and I would have a little bit of like Dawn dish soap, just a small bit in the
Okay.
bathtub. And I would lay the slides down and just let them soak for a little bit. And it will kind of help with, this is gross, but any of the crud that's on the inside, it'll help loosen it up. And after like 20 minutes or so, I will take a cleaning rod, wrap it in muslin or cheesecloth, and I'll swab out the outer slide. And what that will do is it'll clean out any like food particles, any coffee particles, anything that's built up. And from there, and be very careful that you don't hit the bottom crook of the slide. So make sure that the cleaning rod is well wrapped.
Okay.
And then from there, I'll just reapply grease as I would normally.
All right. Good. Good. It's amazing how bad some students let their main slides get, where
Oh,
they don't even
I've seen
move.
horror
You can hear
stories.
them go as you.
Oh,
Oh, yeah. So
yeah,
good
yeah.
tips.
And then one last thing, I would say once a year, bring your horn into a trusted tech. We have a repair department here at Shires for all of our custom and Q series. But if you find a good tech near you, just take your horn in once a year. It's just like going to a doctor's appointment
Hmm.
for a checkup, just to make sure everything is aligned. You know, your valve isn't losing pressure. It's just a good thing to just like have your horn checked over.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have any thoughts on how often to give it a chemical bath, like a real deep cleaning?
Once every couple years.
Yeah. Not all the time.
It's pretty abrasive. Yeah, yeah, it's pretty abrasive, and you know, if there's and it really depends on the condition of the horn, because if the horn is already falling apart, like a chem clean will not be great. So it's just something that I would talk to your tech about.
Yeah. It just brought to something to mind. The lacquer that we use on
Yeah.
a student instrument, a beginning instrument, versus the pro instrument. They're different lacquers, right?
Yeah, so like the lacquer acts as a protective sealant. So every single component that we have goes through our lacquer booth. It's lacquered unless otherwise specified, which doesn't always, it generally does not happen. But like for a professional horn, you have a very thin coat of lacquer because you want the horn to vibrate as naturally as possible. Whereas for a student horn, you're really more interested in protecting the horn.
Yeah, we use in the Eastman, like the ETB221, we use what's called an epoxy lacquer. It's
Oh, okay.
really durable. But and it's meant so that when it comes back from a rental student, you can put it in that chem bath and clean it out and rent it again, and it looks good. But it doesn't have the same resonance and sound that the nitrocellulose lacquer that we use on the step-up instruments and the custom instruments does. So
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, big two.
Yeah.
Just thinking about, I've seen people leave pro horns in chemical baths too long,
Oh no.
and
No,
that
no,
nitrocellulose
no.
lacquer is gone. Oops.
Yep. Oh man, that like hurts my
Yeah,
soul.
yeah. If anybody wants to learn more about Shires, where would you send them?
You can come to our website, seshires.com, or you can always shoot us an email at info@seshires.com, and we're super happy to answer any questions you might have. Um, we geek out on equipment. We're happy to geek out with you guys.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I can hear a player in the background right now. Which brings it to
Yeah.
mind. Everybody there is a musician, and they're all brass players. These are
Yeah.
some of my favorite people to hang out with.
Oh my God, brass players, all we want to do is play brass ensemble and drink beer. That's all we want to do
That's
and like hang out.
pretty easy. Hey, yeah, pretty fun.
Yeah, yeah. It's a good crowd of people.
Yeah, it is. Well, thanks so much for all your time and the information on trombones. I encourage anybody to reach out to Alexis on the website, seshires.com. She's a wealth of information and really great at talking about trombones.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
We hope you found the information in this episode useful and something you can use in your everyday life as an ed rep. If there is a topic you'd like to learn more about and have presented on a future episode of Ed Rep Radio, or you'd like to give us some feedback in general, please email us at edrepradio@eastmanstrings.com. To learn more about Eastman Music Company, go to our website, eastmanmusiccompany.com, or give your Eastman rep a call. Thanks, and drive safe.